Hello, Sunday Seminary, and welcome back to our final installment of the fall semester. This will be a quick video where I'll read the Shunnamite woman's story real quickly, offer a couple of final thoughts, and then we'll start looking towards the spring semester. We've had a couple of suggestions for prophets. And someone mentioned Jeremiah. Somebody else said maybe some of the other prophets that we have. Maybe an overview of the prophets. I'm leaning towards an overview of the prophets myself. I think we can start with 8th century prophets like Isaiah and Micah, and Amos and Hosea, and that would be a fun place to start. And maybe move into the exile with Jeremiah and Ezekiel. That might be a good semester. So let me know if those sound interesting to you. But for today, we'll start with the story of the Shunnamite woman. So she comes back, right? The Shunnamite woman looks a lot like the widow of Zarephath. That's from 1 Kings 17. The Shunnamite woman's story appears in 2 Kings 4. It's part of that long, really beautiful story from Elisha. That has to do with death and life, the life that comes back into this woman's son who had died. And this woman reappears here in chapter 8. So Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, that's kind of a way of the author saying, look back at 2 Kings 4, arise and depart with your household and sojourn wherever you can, for the Lord has called for a famine and will come upon the land for 7 years. So Elisha's given her some like foreknowledge, right? Some secret knowledge about what's going to happen, that there will be a famine and that she's supposed to go someplace else to survive the famine. This is a common thing that happened in the ancient world. If there wasn't enough food, enough water, people would have to go somewhere to find it. We see the Holy Family doing this in Genesis, right? The family of the blessing. They have to leave. Abram and Sarah have to leave the land. Joseph, right, goes down and prepares a place in Egypt for the family while the famine is happening in Canaan. So here we see that another famine in Canaan. There's a famine that's going to come and it will last 7 years. This sounds a little bit like Elijah, right, and his years of no rain. So the woman arose and she did according to the word of the man of God. So remember, their words are important, these prophets, what they say, but also what they do. So here's the saying part. He gave her some secret knowledge. And then she went with her household and sojourned in the lands of the Philistines for 7 years, right? The enemies of Israel. This happens all the time. David makes his family go live with the king of Moab, which is a place that is not always friendly with Israel. During the time when Saul is trying to kill him, and then David actually goes to find safety in the Philistines too. Yeah, we think of the Philistines being the mortal enemies of Israel, but they were kind of on and off again friends, if that makes sense. They're like neighbors, like cousins, kind of. They're always there. Sometimes they're friendly, sometimes they're not, depending on what you want and what they want. So here they are actually a place of refuge for the Israelites. So at the end of 7 years, when the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, she went to appeal to the king for her house and her land. So when people leave, right, other people can take over that land. And when you come back, you have a legal dispute. In fact, in Palestine right now, there's a legal dispute about who owns the land, right? Certain people left the land. Certain people were removed from the land for different circumstances during the leading up to and then after the creation of the state of Israel in 1947. What's the status of that land, right? Do people have a right to return to the land or not? So this woman leaves her land, right, but then comes back and says, I left it for a reason, but I've come back, right? Can I have it back now? So this story really is about that question. Can people come back to their land in Canaan or Israel? And is this true that God has given them that land in perpetuity, right? And this is one of those questions. So tell me all the great things that Elisha has done. I'm sorry. So she goes to appeal to the king for her house and her land, right? So she actually, this is what you do. You would actually, if the law was tricky, you might go to a local judge. If the judge ruled against you, instead of appealing to the Supreme Court, you would appeal to a king. So she goes to the king. Now the king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, tell me all the great things that Elisha has done, right? So Elisha, this kind of miraculous prophet, right, has done all these amazing things, and the king wants in on it, right? So Gehazi, remember, he's run afoul of Elisha a few times, but he's conducting this kind of this informational session here. And while he's telling the king about how Elisha had restored the dead to life, including this woman's son, right? This is years later. The king just kind of, I guess, wants to catch up. Behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life appealed to the king for her house and her land. So she shows up, right? Gehazi's telling this story about what Elisha has done. And at that exact same moment, this woman pops in. I'm the main character of that story, right? And Gehazi said, "Oh my lord, hey, here's that woman, and here's her son who Elisha restored to life." So the kid's sitting right there, right? But they're not just there as an object lesson in how great Elisha is. They're there because they have a problem. And the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed an official for her, saying, hey, restore all that was hers, together with all the produce of the fields, from the day that she left the land until now. And here we see that it's a brief story, but it's a story that involves land and access to land, right, in perpetuity. This is the same kind of thing that Elijah was interested in with Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21. It's an age-old principle, at least according to the Mosaic law, that Israelites had access to land. Everyone had access to land, and you couldn't lose it, really, right? That's the whole Jubilee idea, that you get it back. So the king had to intervene and make justice happen, but there's these principles of justice that were being ignored or obscured. In this story, the king actually ends up being kind of a good guy. Notice that it's an anonymous king here, right? It's just the king. So this story doesn't highlight the king being a hero or anything like that. So I just bring that up because it's this wonderful kind of conclusion to the Shunnamite woman's story, and she, this character that you got to love in chapter 4 comes back in chapter 8, but it also ties together those themes of life, of the access to the land, and of God's involvement with the people, and that God is really leading this kind of salvation for the people, but salvation broadly conceived, right? Not just kind of one's soul, but all parts of one's life and even the land being tied to that aspect of salvation. And that's what these men of God do, right? So after that, there are a few stories, but the main thing that happens in chapter 9 and chapter 8 are these major transformations in power. So when Elisha was anointed by Elijah, God said that God was going to change the power structure in Aram, or Syria, right, and also in Israel. And that's what we see happen in chapters 8 and 9, near the end of Elisha's ministry, which is amazing, right? Those things are supposed to, it seems like those things are supposed to happen right when Elisha comes into his own, maybe back in 1 Kings, or 2 Kings chapter 2 or something, but instead they take a while to turn around. But there's this major transformation, and it seems like it might be a good thing that Jehu becomes king of Israel, because his name is a Yahwistic name. He loves Yahweh, but he also kills a lot of people, including Jezebel. And what's amazing is that the deaths of these people, including Jezebel, are not seen as positive things. They're not seen as like godly things to do. Jehu tries to kill all of the Baal worshipers in the country, and it's not celebrated. It's lifted up as this kind of horrific thing that happens. This is to say that worshiping Yahweh doesn't mean that everything works out right? You can have good theology and still have terrible practice. And I think that's what we see with Jehu here, is that sometimes we think that someone's going to become the hero of our story. But in fact, just because they believe the right things, they think the right things, they say the right things. But in fact, what you do matters more. And so Jehu seems to be this turning point towards like saving Israel. But really, it's this downsliding that actually ends up dragging Israel down to its demise. That is the northern kingdom of Israel. And we can see the end of Elisha's story. Elisha pops back just very briefly in chapter 13, the death of Elisha, chapter 13, verses 14 through 21. What's amazing to me is that you see in this story, this final story of Elisha, this kind of tension that's been with Elisha since the moment that God picked Elisha in 1 Kings 19, when Elijah was out in the wilderness. So Elisha both is like kind of saying, let's shoot these arrows, and we'll like hit Aram as many times as we shoot the arrows. It's this kind of violent thing that seems good. But then in the very end, they throw his body in a grave, Elisha's, and he touches. There's someone who dies and falls into the grave, and they pop back up to life. That is, that Elisha has both this kind of terrifying power that is associated with death, but also is associated with life. And that this seems to be this kind of power that God has, right? That Elisha brings forth into the world. That God is, in the C.S. Lewis, in the Chronicles of Narnia, when C.S. Lewis says, he's writing, Lucy, I think, is asking, is this Aslan, character, this lion, is he safe? No, he's not safe, Lucy, but he's good, right? So that's what we see, I think, embodied in these Elijah and Elisha stories, is that God is not safe. God is involved in all kinds of things that might be terrifying to us. God's power alone is terrifying. At the same time, God is ultimately a force for life in the cosmos, in the world, in our own lives, in our communities, and looking to these people who can be mediators of God's power, of God's presence, of God's word in our own day and age. That's the crucial task for us, but also to say that God's power and God's presence are often not seen in things being nice or happy. Elijah and Elisha aren't like that. Often they can be seen as disrupting things that exist in the world, but disrupting them in such a way that they give a space that allows for life to emerge. So that's where I'll stop right now. But next semester, we're going to come back to this question of prophets and prophecy and of death and of life. And I think we'll start with the book of Amos. So I look forward to it. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And I will see you all. Thank goodness that the vaccine is on its way. May God be with us and preserving us in the midst of this strange time. Amen.